Welcome to the Smoke Pit. If you've been around the channel for a while, by now you know what the Smoke Pit is. It's a place where guys and gals will swap stories. This episode is comprised of several stories from your fellow channel subscribers about their encounters with black, triangular-shaped, for want of a better word, aircraft. Aircraft that these individuals mostly all say was flying low to the ground at slow speeds or hovering, and then disappearing or rocketing off at high speeds. Some of these people are military service members. Others are people who live in close proximity to the military bases where these craft are presumed to have been launched from. In some respects, this TR-3 Bravo aircraft, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, TR-3 Bravo, is widely considered to be a known technology with incredible flight capabilities and is essentially a reverse-engineered UFO, although officially, it doesn't exist. And if it does, like any other classified military project or weapon, there are probably many good reasons why its existence isn't public knowledge. But clearly, there are many reports of people sighting these things, even in broad daylight. So, it's not as if it's really any great secret. I've got a pile of at least 20 stories about these, so one measly episode won't be enough to cover all of them, but I will try to organize them as best I can. I hope those who have shared their stories don't mind, but because many of these stories were shared either in a YouTube comment or in some short format, I've also taken the liberty of adding some punctuation, moving some stuff around, adding or changing a few words here and there to clarify where and when the story took place, or otherwise by removing any information that was given that wasn't necessary to the overall story. With that, let's get to the stories. The following account was provided by one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username JD Lambo 6926. I'm 39 years old. I grew up in Arkansas, maybe an hour's drive from the Jacksonville Air Force Base. When I was 18, me and a childhood friend were headed home one day from a baseball game, driving down an old country road. Out of nowhere, a triangle-shaped object about the size of a school bus drifted slowly over the middle of the road ahead of us. It passed right over the tops of the trees that line the road. When it reached the middle of the road, it stopped, and then it just went in reverse, right back across the road, and disappeared back behind the cover of the trees, and we couldn't see it anymore. We weren't super excited or anything, but just as soon as it was gone, I remember saying, "Did you see that?" And Chris, my buddy, said, "Yeah, I did. That was wild." Now, over 20 years later, me and Chris both work at the VA hospital, and every now and then we will cross paths at work, and that is the first thing we will remind each other of, the time that we saw this craft. This was before drones, at least commercially speaking to my knowledge. And anytime someone tells me about seeing a round-shaped UFO, I am always a little bit skeptical, but when someone says that they've seen a triangular one, I think, maybe. We both thought it might be a stealth bomber, but I've never heard of one that could fly that slow and then just reverse. Again, we do have the Jacksonville Air Force Base nearby, but we were still maybe 60 miles from there, and this thing was not traveling any faster than we were, driving down that country road at maybe 40 miles an hour. Part of my conviction in believing the stories contained in this episode, because like I said, there's 20 overall that I have so far, is that most people who shared them never really seemed to make an effort to provide more information about the craft beyond what they saw with their own two eyes, like this gentleman, and I certainly appreciate what seems to be a humble honesty. For instance, as JD Lambo mentioned about reasoning whether or not the craft could have been flown from an Air Force base 60 miles away, and he thought maybe not because of how slowly he saw the craft moving. You'll notice in the following accounts that although often seen traveling at slower speeds like he described, The aircraft clearly has the ability to fly at extremely high speeds, in 3 dimensions. But since he didn't see the craft pulling these fast maneuvers, and he lost sight of it behind the trees, he could only reason with the limited information that he had, and that the craft could only fly very slowly. I mention this because some people who discuss this aircraft, call it an aircraft, online, they do portray themselves as knowledgeable, citing various technological aspects of the craft with seeming indifference. They talk confidently about anti-gravity engines and pressurized mercury and nuclear plasma energy devices which produce the anti-gravity fields around the ship, as if all this could be read in any high school textbook. That jargon is all Greek to me. I'm a simple guy, and I expect that maybe it's more of a combined knowledge, an amalgamation of different UFO studies that these people have done and bits of leaked information, if anything. And maybe they do know what they're talking about. I'm not going to sit here and say that they don't, because I don't know that for certain. But I kind of got the impression that people who speak knowledgeably about it, unless they are people who have worked on these crafts and they are 100% certain of their knowledge about it because of their involvement, and perhaps they are potentially violating their security clearances by discussing this information openly, people will, there wasn't there a guy who went on Discord and he was giving away government secrets for clout? There are people like that, so it's not entirely impossible. But as the witnesses in this episode and the other stories I have compiled indicate, this aircraft was something entirely unknown to them, and it was not something they ever expected to see flying across the sky. So it's not as if these things are just common knowledge to the whole population. This next account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers, who goes by the username Estern001. I was in the Navy from 1986 to 1998. This event happened on March 31st, 1997. I remember it because it was also the night before we set sail on Westpac, which is a 6-month deployment where we float around the Western Pacific region. Anyway, our ship, the USS Constellation, was docked in San Diego. My girlfriend and I were spending my last night ashore, visiting family up in Palm Springs. So we leave Palm Springs around midnight, heading back to San Diego. It was a clear night, and there was almost no traffic on the highway. Since most of this highway stretches across open desert, the sky out there is super clear, and you can see a lot of stars. And side note here, I've driven between California and Arizona many times. You pass by Palm Springs. He's absolutely right. It's very clear. I'm like looking out the window at the stars. Anyway, somewhere between cities, we suddenly noticed these lights in the sky. They were white lights in a triangular pattern, and they were attached to a triangular-shaped craft. The craft was dark in color and not really visible. We could only see the outline of it because as it moved across the sky, it was clearly blocking the stars that were behind it. So I pull over and we get out of the car and we stand there watching it for about 10 to 15 minutes. It was massive and was just drifting slowly and silently across the sky. Look, I was an aircraft mechanic in the Navy. I had worked on the flight deck at night for many deployments at that time. I know what aircraft look like and sound like in the night sky. This was an unidentified flying object like nothing I have ever seen in the military or otherwise. Considering his travel route from Palm Springs to San Diego, the nearest U.S. Air Force base that this craft might have been launched from, somewhere in the in-between, would be the March Air Reserve Base in Riverside County, which he would have driven past. And considering he said that the craft was massive, and other accounts that you'll hear talk about how the craft is often seen flying very low to the ground, in some cases less than 50 feet, I get the sense that there is a sort of visual phenomenon, especially at night, that happens when seeing this craft overhead, because it is completely silent. and there is that bizarre absence of sound to deal with. And while viewers are looking up at it in the night sky without any reference, they might not realize how close it is, and that's why he thought it was massive. The ship is described as really only being as long as a school bus, like the previous account, which isn't massive, but it could seem to be larger, right, if the witness thinks that it's flying much higher above them than it really is. It's the same phenomenon, I expect, or maybe a reversal of this phenomenon, that when you look at the moon while it's coming up over the horizon, it looks massive when there's mountains and trees and buildings to compare it to, but once it rises up overhead and there are no visual references to compare it with, it just looks smaller in the open sky. This third account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers named Gavin, who most recently goes by the username PVPenne. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. His sighting took place further north, in California, but this time near the coastline, at least 250 to 300 miles to the northwest from the sighting near Palm Springs. I live in the city of San Luis Obispo, just south of Camp Roberts. About a year ago, which would be 2021 since he posted this comment 11 months ago, I was out trying to catch a glimpse of a meteor shower when a black triangle with dim amber and red lights flew right above my head. It was dead silent and really slow for something flying. This thing, however, wasn't headed towards the military base, but was on a direct path to the nuclear power station at Diablo Canyon, which is only a few miles to the west of me on the shoreline. The military base Gavin mentioned, Camp Roberts, is an active California National Guard post. It does have a rather shabby-looking runway, but not a single hangar bay or other aircraft to speak of in the satellite imagery. 30 miles to the south is another U.S. Army base named Camp San Luis Obispo, which, although not as active now as it was during the war years from the 1940s to the 70s, like Camp Roberts, it still serves as a military training camp with field and garrison facilities. Neither of these bases, however, seem to be feasible locations for the housing and maintenance of any kind of aircraft. However, there are two Air Force bases within a reasonable proximity of San Luis Obispo: Edwards Air Force Base 160 miles to the east, and Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is also located near the coastline, only 40 miles to the south. And perhaps it's worth noting that, more recently, the Vandenberg Air Force Base has been renamed to the Vandenberg Space Force Base and is home to the Combined Force Space Component Command. This unit's mission statement is to plan, integrate, conduct, and assess global space operations in order to deliver combat-relevant space capabilities to combatant commanders, coalition partners, the Joint Force, and the nation. The following account was provided by yet another one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username StacyN2541. I have absolutely seen these, and she was referring to something she saw in an episode which wasn't about the TR-3 Bravo, so not sure what she might have been referring to. Maybe the triangular formations of lights that people were reporting in that episode. Anyway, I have absolutely seen these. Too Long Didn't Read version, I saw a military stealth aircraft fly over my house, very low, completely silent, and in the daytime. Well, Stacy, we're going to read the long version. She says, I live about 30 minutes north of Crane Naval Base in central Indiana. I have lived between several military bases most of my life and have seen and heard probably thousands of military aircraft flying by. This was maybe 2010? I saw something I have never seen before. I was in my backyard in the daytime. It was a cloudy day, pretty sure the kids were in school because I was alone, and I noticed a shadow moving along the ground from something overhead very slowly. So I looked up, and moving north was a gray, black, almost completely triangular military craft. It was not black, it was not gray, it was darker than gray, like smoke. I just stood there for nearly 15 seconds in shock, watching as this thing glided silently over my house. It was so low, I actually worried it would graze the roof. It was at least the width of my house. As far as its size, from wingtip to wingtip, this thing was at least the size of the side of my house in length. Not the back of my house, the longer portion of my house, but the side of my house. So maybe 26 feet from wingtip to wingtip. And I have Googled stealth jets, and it definitely matches some of the pictures. I just cannot get over the fact that this was absolutely silent, and it was so low, I felt like I could have reached up and touched it. And it also, as far as what was keeping it off the ground, it didn't change the temperature on the ground. It flew right over me. If anything, it felt cooler underneath it. But why was it flying so low? My house was on the outer edge of town and on the edge of my suburb. This thing was flying into and over a very large town. But once it passed the house, I couldn't see it anymore because the house was now blocking my view. And it took me less than a minute to get over my shock so I could run into the house and, out the front door and see it again. But it was gone. There was no exhaust blowback, zero engine noise, and no identity markings. I could be wrong about the year, but it was at least between 2003 and 2012. I have never shared this story before because I felt like whatever it was, it had to be top secret. Fantastic as her story is, in correlation with all these other stories from viewers, this story from Stacy compares well to much of what others have described seeing and seems much more believable in that context, but that's just me. It's like what J.D. Lambo said in his account. Even he has a hard time believing if someone said they saw a circular UFO because he hasn't seen one himself. But if someone shared a story about a slow-flying, silent, black, triangular craft seen hovering low over the ground, it's much easier to believe for him because he's seen something like it. Seeing is clearly believing. The rest of us are apparently just missing out on seeing all this cool stuff. Taking a look at the Crane Naval Base, otherwise called Naval Surface Warfare Center Crane, there doesn't appear to be much by way of aircraft facilities or anything that would indicate the base can host the arrival or departure of at least fixed-wing aircraft. The base does have a Prowler aircraft on static display in one of their parking lots, but looking at the ceremonial photos when that aircraft arrived and was decommissioned, the plane was clearly trucked onto the base because it said it landed at the Monroe County Airport in Bloomington, which is about 35 miles away. Nothing to say a craft that can land and take off vertically couldn't have been housed at the base, though. This next account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username JimMochi7317. I've had a similar experience with a UFO or a craft following my family while driving, but it was a dark gray, blackish, metallic, triangle-shaped object with 3 holes underneath each corner, which I assumed were for lights, but they were off. It somehow looked like the craft was morphing, but now that I think about it, it could have just been the haze surrounding it because it never changed shape. It just appeared like it was. I can't really explain it. We were at a stoplight when the craft passed over the car. It was a Chevy Impala, and it was bigger than our car, but not huge, and it was very low. So low that if a tall person were to stand on the car, they would probably be able to reach up and touch it. It was hovering, rotating, and gliding forward at the same time, and the corners of the triangle were more rounded. It passed over from the right, and by the time it got to the left side of the car, we had just turned right into a gas station. I turned back to see where it was going, but it was gone. And there's no way it could have flown out of sight that fast. This thing was going so slowly that I could have walked faster than it was moving. I even looked around at other people at the gas station to see if they were looking up, but no one else seemed to have noticed it. This was around 9 or 10 p.m. at night. This individual, Jim, might have some companionship with Stacy, because he too said he could have practically touched it. It was flying so low. And that by the time he tried to see it again, it had disappeared without a sound. The following account was provided by, you guessed it, yet another one of your fellow viewers, who goes by the username The Resident Teacher 2438. And he doesn't waste any time. He gets right to the point. TR3 Bravo. One has flown over my head about 1,000 feet. I could have hit it with a rock. Guessing he's just... I don't know anybody that can throw a rock 1,000 feet in the air, but we know what he means. It's flying pretty low. Ironically, I was reading Jim Marr's Alien Agenda and had went outside for a drink. For some reason, something told me to bring my phone, and of course, I didn't. What could happen, right? Well, I was outside thinking to myself, when am I going to see something? Then I look off to the right and watch as a ball of light closes a large distance in 5 seconds. This thing slows down and then it flies over me, silent as hell. And it was a big-ass black triangle, but it had blue and red tracking lights at the rear. In the center, on the bottom, was what must have been the gravity drive, which looked like a circular half globe protruding from the base. It was like looking into a sea of black, shimmering silk. Again, silent as hell. By the way, I live in Indianapolis, and the nearest base is Wright-Patterson. And if you know that place, well, you've probably heard some of the rumors of the kinds of toys that they keep stored there. Now, the first thing is the distance that he said, 1,000 feet in the air. I'm trying to imagine it myself. It's not that high, but for him to describe it in such detail, maybe it was a little bit lower like the others have described, maybe 1,000 feet was or was not a correct estimate. But anyway, as he mentioned, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located near the Indiana-Ohio border in the state of Ohio. And considering he too lives in Indiana, only about 60 miles away from Stacy's home, maybe that base is where we might reason the craft that Stacy saw also originated from, rather than the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Crane Naval Base. Although I'm not sure what, if any, correlation it might have, it's interesting that the base, Wright-Patterson, which was formerly known as Wright Field, was indirectly involved with well-documented military sightings of UFOs in the 1940s, which took place the same day as the Mantell UFO incident in Kentucky, January 7, 1948. And as cited by Richard Haynes in his book, Advanced Aerial Devices Reported During the Korean War, it's probably no coincidence that only 2 weeks later, on January 22, 1948, Project Sign, also known as Project Saucer, was initially established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Project Sign was an official U.S. government study of unidentified flying objects undertaken by the United States Air Force and was active for most of 1948. It was the precursor to Project Grudge in 1949, which was then followed by Project Blue Book from 1952 to 1969. Also, during his guest appearance for 90 minutes on one of Art Bell's coast-to-coast radio programs, retired Air Force captain and UFO investigator Robert Collins discussed his research into government and military UFO cover-ups, which also involved Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Collins said he had seen official drawings of tunnels, vaults, and underground infrastructure at the base. These secret facilities were alleged to house alien craft and bodies, but such materials were moved primarily to Los Alamos National Laboratory and Area 51 around 1982 to 1983, Collins stated. And now, of course, more recently in 2023, there has been media coverage of apparent whistleblowers and Air Force officials, more Air Force officials, coming forward about their knowledge of the existence and government possession of alien craft and even alien bodies. So, maybe the rumors about the Air Force storing toys at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio at least has some weight to it. Which brings us back to this episode's topic, which is the TR-3 Bravo. This final account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username Dewey Plank 9850. I grew up within 200 miles from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and one night me and a friend were heading home from Columbus, Ohio, at about 3:30 in the morning. It was dark, and you could see car lights from a long way away, even if you couldn't see the road. And so my buddy said, "Be careful, I see those lights up ahead, we must be coming up on an intersection." So when we got to the last curve, and we turned the corner, and realized that there's no intersection, we then realized that floating about 20 feet off the ground was a huge triangular object. It had lights around its outer edge, and it had spotlights that started shining on us. So I pulled over because the lights were blinding. We got out and just stood there and watched it just sit in the air, making a slight humming noise. This happened in the late 70s, and I'm not much of a believer in aliens, so I told my friend when it was brought up that, look, I didn't see any aliens, and we were about 35 miles south of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So I figure more than likely the Air Force just isn't telling us everything that they have. So shoot forward to the early 90s. I had the privilege of having dinner one evening with a retired 2-star general. When I told him the story and my thoughts on it, he told me I had made an accurate guess about what it was. Since it had become declassified by that time, he told me what was up. In the 70s, the Air Force was doing experiments on hard-shelled dirigibles. These were new polymers coming about back then. He even showed me a picture of one. Sure enough, it was exactly what we saw. It never made sense to me that aliens that could get here would need spotlights. Usually, the simplest explanation is the best one. As for this story and the explanation of the retired general, the term hard-shelled dirigibles is an awfully strange way of describing a triangular metal craft with anti-gravitational capabilities, I thought. As if the general were saying that the craft was able to hover because the interior was filled with helium or some other lighter-than-air gas. Or perhaps, I'm only guessing here, maybe in an effort not to disclose too much information, that is just one way to keep a secret technology a secret. Rather than denying it, the general openly admits that the craft exists, you got me. He congratulates the witness on their deductions and then explains the nature of the technology he saw as something much simpler than it really is. Again, that's just a guess on my part. But these are military folks we're talking about. They are under orders not to disclose some things depending on what is and isn't declassified. And I'm not saying Dewey was at all wrong for believing the explanation he was given. And perhaps I have misunderstood it, but I'd merely point out that compiled with these other stories, and again, his story took place in the 70s, at least, 30 years before any of these other accounts, so you figure they might have had time to improve on the technology or something. It seems unlikely that an aircraft powered by the levitating properties of helium could also shoot around the sky in multiple directions or seemingly disappear in an instant at high speeds, as these other craft have been described doing. in comparison to the other accounts, Dewey's unfortunately doesn't mention how his encounter with the aircraft in the late 70s ended, how it departed, or whether he simply lost interest, got bored, got back in the car, and him and his buddy drove off, as the craft then just remained where it was hovering above the ground, or if it floated off slowly, or whatever it did. So we don't know what the technology was capable of back then by his account. So again, maybe it was improved in its function, and we can only guess from this point. Clearly, if these TR-3 Bravo crafts do exist, which you can decide for yourself to believe or not to believe, it is a highly advanced technology that is being kept secret by the powers that be. It's bizarre to me that this technology appears to have existed for decades, considering the reports of the TR-3 Bravo sightings seem to go all the way back into the 70s and 80s. I'm sure there are many theories or suspicions about how our military would have acquired this technology, be it more practically from decades of scientific experimentation, or from salvaging the wreckage of crashed extraterrestrial vehicles. As it was described by at least one individual, the half-sphere protrusion on the bottom of the aircraft that he saw that looked like a sea of shimmering black silk. Online search results will tell us that the TR-3 Bravo is supposedly powered by a reverse-engineered anti-gravity drive that was recovered from a crashed alien spacecraft. Other UFOs are often described as having a similarly hazy appearance, which by most accounts is said to be the result of this anti-gravity drive and the distorting effect it has on the air around it while operating, like a heat haze or something. And for all we know, the information like this that is being shared openly and discussed, maybe it's someone who wants us to believe this is true in an effort to keep us from understanding anything of any value. Quite possibly those in charge of safekeeping this technology, if it exists, don't even care if people share these kinds of stories about seeing the craft. They might even promote it or put out falsified stories to keep people confused and guessing, to similarly convince foreign allies and enemies that the technology doesn't exist at all and it's just a big hoax. But if even one of these stories is true, clearly they were willing to conduct test flights over populated areas in view of American citizens, even in broad daylight. So much for hiding it. But then, just maybe, the best defense with keeping large secrets is a good offense. Let the existence of these aircraft become synonymous with UFO sightings, which many people certainly fabricate for clout on the internet or are simply mistaken in what they saw, whether it be an insect, a bird, or something else that they mistook for something more phenomenal. Clearly, many of us just want to be a part of the excitement of seeing a UFO with our own eyes. Again, I'm just speculating here, but why wouldn't somebody capitalize on this UFO fervor and, have this highly classified technology become muddled up with all these wild theories and speculations that we make to the point where most practical people would then refuse to even believe it exists and would just ignore it as a hoax. Theories abound online about Nazi UFO technology and Project Paperclip with regard to the TR-3 Bravo. Maybe they're true, maybe they aren't. But even the thought of using the word Nazi and UFO in the same sentence, admittedly, that just sounds very bizarre to most average listeners, even if it was true, right? So what better way to keep something secret and ensure nobody even bothers to put much thought into it by simply never confirming anything and just allowing us to keep going down rabbit holes and making wild speculations. I do try to read all the comments that these videos get, and I will admit that this channel is geared more towards entertainment as opposed to informing my audience of anything useful. Has anybody learned anything from the channel? Maybe, maybe not. Take from these stories what you will. But how many people will hear these stories that I just shared and immediately offer their opinion that these people are clearly all delusional, are liars, or that this channel is complete nonsense? And conversely, like I mentioned earlier, there are others who consider themselves knowledgeable about UFOs for whatever reason, And they will say that anyone who doesn't know about these crafts and this technology clearly isn't paying attention and needs to wake up. And thus we as a society go back and forth pointlessly arguing. Honestly, how many more widely known UFO encounters have really ever amounted to the entire population fully and completely accepting the existence of these crafts, whether they are man-made or extraterrestrial? None, to my knowledge. These are events that clearly receive little to no media coverage and end up becoming more of an intriguing mystery than a historical event. And that's why you're hearing about it on this channel, right, and not somewhere more professional, I guess we'll say. So whether we believe them or not, I expect these stories will ultimately amount to the same thing. Eventually, we will all lose interest and focus on something more relevant to our daily lives. We got families to take care of. And perhaps some things are kept secret for a reason, because we live in a world full of secrets and lies, and of both allies and enemies. I suppose the only thing we might walk away with after listening to these stories is the understanding that if someday any one of us is out and about and we suddenly look up and see one of these strange triangular craft hovering over us, we may not be as shocked to see it as these individuals clearly were when they first saw it. So, if you see it, just give it a wave, a thumbs up, scream, "Go Air Force." You know, this is probably one of the coolest things they have ever been involved with. And considering the newly created Space Force is now a branch of the Air Force, I mean, did we think that they might not need actual spacecraft? I say this half-jokingly, but if aliens ever do invade, we probably want to have a fair shot at matching their capabilities, don't we? Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the credits. In previous Smoke Pit episodes, I did encourage everyone to share their personal stories in the comment section of the videos, and these stories here were collectively gathered from that, and then they were shared maybe over the last year, time-wise. And while I would still encourage you to continue to do so, if you feel compelled to want to type out your story in the comment section, the comments, because of the subscriber increase, have been steadily piling up on me, and if you want to ensure that I do read your story and have the opportunity to work it into a Smoke Pit episode, you might want to consider submitting the story directly. I don't want to miss reading it, but that's just the way it is. I had to move some things around, so in an effort to keep things organized, along with launching the wartimestories.com website for merchandise, thank you if you check it out for that, but if you do head to that website, I've also got a link to a submission form there for stories. So whether you're sharing your own personal story or there's a story you know about that you would like to see produced into an episode in future, that's the way to do it now. At least that way I am guaranteed to read those stories that you send me. After 3 years of running the channel and diving into online articles, military records, books, stories shared by viewers, I've got hundreds of stories collected, and while I am working to now train a team and get everything moving so that we can speed up production and convert all these stories into episodes more quickly, I'm always open to new story ideas. It has been slow going, with me working alone on the channel primarily for the last 3 years with some few exceptions, but as such, we have barely scratched the surface with all of the wild stories there are still left to tell. And like I mentioned at the onset of this episode, whatever these TR-3 Bravo aircraft are, there are many more stories about them, and this will not be the last time we talk about triangular-shaped UFOs, among many others on the channel. One story I received from Nick over at Tales from the Grid Square even seems to indicate that Marines and soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq have had encounters with these aircraft during combat operations. Even one very bizarre story where a Marine, I think it was, said he blacked out after seeing one of these craft in the night sky above him, only to then wake up the next morning in a different location with no idea how he got there. It's a very strange story. And I have found a couple videos which may or may not validate those kinds of stories, or they might be hoaxes. But anyway, that is a story for another time. To my viewers for watching the annoying ads on YouTube, To those who purchase merchandise, and of course, my dedicated and generous patrons and YouTube channel members, thank you for helping me keep this channel going for as long as it has, and for as long as it takes to cover the rest of these stories. Thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, no matter what you are currently dealing with. I pray that God will be with you, and I will see you in the next episode.